They drank human blood to seal their brotherhood. They tortured children to break their enemies. They turned their backs on family, honor, and even the gods themselves. This is the true story of the most evil Vikings who ever lived. In the cold waters of the Baltic Sea lies a secret that Europe tried to forget. On a remote island called Valin, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of horrors that shocked even the blood-soaked Viking age. Here, in the ruins of an ancient fortress, they found the remains of a warrior brotherhood so twisted and cruel that their own Norse kinsmen called them monsters. These were the Vikings, and their story begins with betrayal, blood, and a darkness that would consume everything they touched. The year was 960, and the Viking world was changing. Christianity was spreading like wildfire across Scandinavia. Kings were bending the knee to Christ, abandoning the old gods who had made them strong. In Denmark, a young prince named Harald, later called Harald Bluetooth, was forcing his people to convert. Churches rose where sacred groves once stood. Christian bells rang where war horns once called warriors to battle. But some Vikings would not bow. Some would not forget. And some would choose a path so dark that even Odin himself would turn away in disgust. Among those who refused to accept the new faith was a grizzled warrior named Palnatoke. He had served Harald's father faithfully for decades, had bled on countless battlefields for Denmark's glory. But when Harald demanded he kneel before a Christian altar, Palnatoke spat in the dirt and walked away. He was not alone. Across Denmark, displaced jarls, landless warriors, and fanatic believers in the old ways gathered in secret. They whispered of a place where they could be free, a fortress where the ancient customs would live forever. That place was Jomsborg, a massive fortress on the island of Valin at the mouth of the Oder River. Here, surrounded by treacherous waters and hidden by morning mists, Palnatoke began to build something the world had never seen before. Not just a military base, but a brotherhood that would strip away everything that made Vikings human: family ties, mercy, even the hope of Valhalla. The rules were simple but terrible. No man could show fear, no matter how hopeless the battle. No warrior could retreat, even if it meant certain death. No member could be absent from the fortress for more than 3 days without permission. And most horrifying of all, every new recruit had to prove his worth by killing another warrior and drinking his blood while it was still warm. Archaeological evidence from Valin Island paints a picture of systematic brutality. Mass burial sites contain hundreds of skeletons, men, women, and children from across the Baltic region. Many show signs of torture that went on for days or weeks before death finally came. Ritual knives carved with runic curses. Chains and shackles made specifically for human prisoners. Tools designed for one purpose only: to cause as much pain as possible before the victim died. But the Vikings were not mindless butchers. They were calculating predators who understood that fear was more powerful than any sword. They developed new forms of psychological warfare that would haunt Europe for generations. When they raided a village, they didn't just kill and steal. They performed elaborate rituals designed to break their victims' spirits completely. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records their methods with horrified fascination. Viking raiders would arrive at dawn, their black sails bearing wolf symbols that struck terror into anyone who saw them. They would capture the village elder, usually an old man respected by everyone, and torture him to death in full view of his people. Not quickly, but slowly, methodically, while chanting prayers to forgotten gods. Then came the choice that defined their evil: submit to the old ways, or watch your children die the same way. Those who gave and were branded with wolf marks burned into their flesh. But their torment was just beginning. The Vikings forced new converts to help execute their Christian neighbors, turning communities against themselves and leaving psychological wounds that lasted for generations. By 980, the Vikings had grown from a handful of outcasts to nearly 3,000 warriors spread across dozens of ships. They controlled key trade routes in the Baltic, demanding tribute from merchant vessels and burning those who refused to pay. Their fortress had become a city of war, with shipyards, weapon forges, and training ground where young men learned to kill without mercy or remorse. But their greatest innovation was something that would echo through history: the creation of the first truly professional military force in medieval Europe. Unlike traditional Viking warriors who raided seasonally before returning to their farms, the Jomsvikings were soldiers year-round. They had no families to distract them, no land to tend, no loyalty except to their brotherhood and their increasingly twisted interpretation of Norse mythology. They told themselves they were preserving the true Viking way, keeping alive the warrior culture that had made their ancestors great. But something had gone wrong in their isolation. Cut off from normal human relationships, surrounded by constant violence, worshipping gods who seemed to demand ever greater cruelties, the Jomsvikings had become something else entirely. They were still Vikings in their language, their ships, their weapons, but their souls had turned to something darker. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to look. Traditional Viking raiders brought their captives home as slaves. The Jomsvikings killed almost everyone they captured in elaborate rituals. Normal Vikings honored their ancestors and hoped to join them in Valhalla. The Jomsvikings developed new myths about eternal war and endless suffering. Regular Vikings valued honor and reputation above all else. The Jomsvikings valued only fear and death. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve Viking tradition had become its absolute corruption. And now, as word of their atrocities spread across Europe, kings and princes began to ask a terrifying question. If the Jomsvikings could do this to defenseless villagers, what would happen when they turned their attention to armies, to cities, to entire kingdoms? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would shake the Viking world to its very foundations. They had become unstoppable. No army could defeat them. No fortress could hold them back. The Jomsvikings ruled the Baltic Sea through pure terror, until they made one fatal mistake. They challenged a king who refused to be afraid. By 985, the Jomsvikings had become the most feared force in northern Europe. From their island fortress, they commanded a fleet of 60 longships and controlled every major trade route in the Baltic Sea. Merchants paid tribute or died. Coastal villages submitted or burned. Even powerful jarls thought twice before challenging the brotherhood that had turned cruelty into an art form. Their reputation had grown far beyond their actual numbers. Stories spread of Jomsviking berserkers who felt no pain, who could fight for hours with mortal wounds, who laughed as they died as long as they could take enemies with them. Monks in distant monasteries wrote fearful accounts of warriors who worshipped wolf spirits and drank the blood of Christ's faithful servants. Parents used threats of Jomsviking raids to frighten disobedient children into obedience. But the Brotherhood's greatest strength, their complete dedication to war, was also becoming their weakness. For 25 years, they had known only victory. Every battle won, every raid successful, every enemy defeated or destroyed. They had begun to believe their own legend. They thought they truly were invincible, chosen by the old gods for eternal conquest. This dangerous confidence led them to their most ambitious plan yet. King Håkon the Good of Norway had united his fractured kingdom and built it into a powerful force. More importantly for the Jomsvikings, he had refused their demands for tribute. When their envoys arrived at his court demanding payment of gold and Christian slaves, Håkon had their messenger's tongue cut out and sent him back with a message carved into his forehead. Tell your wolf pack that Norway does not bow to dogs. The insult could not be ignored. In their great hall, surrounded by the skulls of defeated enemies and banners taken from conquered cities, Palnatoke and his war chiefs planned something unprecedented: the complete conquest of Norway. They would sail north with their entire fleet, crush Håkon's forces in one massive battle, and establish the first Jomsviking kingdom. It would be the ultimate proof that their way of war was superior to all others. What they didn't understand was that their reputation had finally worked against them. For years, kings across Scandinavia had watched the Jomsvikings grow stronger while doing nothing to stop them. Each ruler hoped the wolf pack would attack someone else, would leave their own territories alone. But Haakon's defiance had shown them all what they should have realized long ago. If the Jomsvikings conquered Norway, no kingdom would be safe. In the autumn of 986, the greatest naval force of the Viking Age set sail from Jomsborg. 60 longships carrying nearly 3,000 warriors, their black wolf banners snapping in the cold wind, their dragon-headed prows cutting through gray Baltic waters like knives through flesh. At their head sailed Palnatoke himself, now white-haired but still deadly, wearing armor made from the ribs of his enemies and carrying a sword blessed with the blood of 100 sacrifices. Archaeological evidence from the battle site shows the incredible scale of what followed. The Battle of Hjörungavágr, the Bay of Joring, involved over 200 ships and more than 10,000 warriors. It was the largest naval engagement of the medieval period, a clash that would determine whether the future belonged to traditional kingdoms or to the new warrior brotherhoods that answered to no law but strength. The battle began at dawn on a gray October morning. The Jomsvikings attacked in their traditional wedge formation, the berserkers howling war songs as they prepared for their pre-battle rituals. These rituals had always terrified their enemies before. The systematic mutilation of prisoners, the drinking of enemy blood, the invocations to wolf spirits, and forgotten gods of war. But King Haakon's forces didn't break and run as so many others had. Instead, they responded with disciplined volleys of arrows and spears, targeting the berserkers before their battle madness could take hold. Ships crashed together with the sound of splintering wood and screaming men. Swords rang against shields, axes bit into flesh and bone, and the sea began to turn red with blood. For the first time in their history, the Jomsvikings found themselves evenly matched. Haakon's warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but the end of their entire way of life. They had no choice but to win, while the Jomsvikings, for all their training and ferocity, had grown used to easy victories against terrified enemies. Then nature itself seemed to turn against the Brotherhood. As the battle reached its climax, with ships burning and warriors dying on all sides, a sudden storm arose from the north. The sagas call it Odin's vengeance. Massive waves that scattered the Jomsviking formation and turned their careful battle plan into chaos. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it. For the first time in their 25-year history, Jomsvikings began to retreat. Not in formation, not as part of a tactical withdrawal, but in panic flight as they realized their legendary invincibility was nothing more than a myth. Ship after ship turned away from the battle, their crews rowing desperately for the open sea. But there would be no mercy for those who had shown none to others. Haakon's forces pursued the fleeing Jomsvikings relentlessly, ramming their ships, boarding their vessels, and showing them exactly the same brutality they had inflicted on countless innocents. The hunters had become the hunted, and the wolves were finally tasting their own blood. By sunset, 30 of the 60 Jomsviking ships had been sunk or captured. Nearly 2,000 of their warriors were dead, including many of their most experienced leaders. Palnatoke himself survived, but barely. His ship reached the safety of Danish waters with only 12 men still alive aboard, and he never fully recovered from wounds received in the battle. The survivors who limped back to Jomsborg found their fortress changed. For the first time, the Great Hall was not filled with victory celebrations, but with the groans of wounded men and the silence of defeat. Their myth of invincibility was shattered, their reputation for unstoppable conquest broken like their ships on the rocks of Hjörungavágr Bay. But their defeat had consequences far beyond their own losses. Kings across Europe realized that the Jomsvikings could be beaten, that they were not supernatural monsters, but merely men who could bleed and die like anyone else. The political balance that had kept the Brotherhood safe through their isolation and reputation was shifting, and enemies were beginning to gather like wolves around wounded prey. The Jomsvikings had spent decades perfecting the art of terror, teaching the world to fear their black sails and wolf banners. Now they would learn what it felt like to be afraid, to face enemies who had no intention of showing mercy or quarter. The hunters had become the hunted, and the final act of their bloody saga was about to begin. The fortress was burning. The brotherhood was dying. And in their final hours, the Jomsvikings would commit an act so horrible that even their enemies would struggle to speak of it. This is how monsters choose to face their own destruction. Word of the defeat at Hjörungavagr spread across Europe faster than wildfire. For 25 years, the Jomsvikings had been a nightmare that kept kings awake at night. Now, suddenly, they were just mortal men who could bleed and die like anyone else. The spell of terror was broken, and Europe's rulers began to sharpen their swords. King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark was the first to move. The Jomsvikings had been his problem from the beginning, outcast from his own kingdom who had grown too powerful to ignore. Their defeat gave him the perfect excuse to finish what his father Harald Bluetooth had started decades earlier. He gathered his fleet and prepared to sail for Jomsborg, bringing with him Polish allies who had suffered under Jomsviking raids for years. But Sweyn was not the only enemy closing in. From the east came Boleslaus the Brave of Poland, leading an army that included survivors from dozens of villages the Jomsvikings had destroyed. From the south sailed Saxon war fleets, their crews hungry for revenge against the brotherhood that had terrorized the Baltic coast. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III sent ships and men, declaring the coming siege a holy war against paganism itself. The Jomsvikings watched their enemies gather from the walls of their island fortress. For the first time in their history, they were the ones being hunted. Ships filled the horizon like storm clouds, carrying armies that outnumbered them 10 to 1. The brotherhood that had once struck fear into the hearts of kings now faced the combined wrath of Christian Europe. Palnatoke, scarred and limping from his wounds at Hjörungavagr, called his remaining war chiefs to council. Only 800 warriors remained of the 3,000 who had sailed to Norway. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, and their legendary confidence had died with their fallen brothers in those cold northern waters. For the first time, doubt crept into voices that had never known uncertainty. Some suggested surrender. Others proposed breaking out in small groups, scattering across the Baltic to fight as individual raiders rather than face certain death in a hopeless siege. But Palnatoke's response silenced them all. We are Jomsvikings. We do not bow, we do not flee, and we do not break our oaths. If we must die, we die as we lived, in defiance of gods and men alike. The siege began in the spring of 987. Catapults hurled stones blessed by Christian priests, their impacts shaking the ancient walls that had never before felt the touch of enemy weapons. Saxon warships blockaded the harbor while Polish infantry stormed the outer defenses. The battle was fierce, but hopeless. 800 warriors could not hold walls designed for 3,000. As their defenses crumbled, something terrible began to change within the surviving Jomsvikings. Cut off from escape, facing certain defeat, they did not turn to prayer or seek honor in their final stand. Instead, they embraced a darkness that shocked even their battle-hardened enemies. They began killing their own prisoners, not quickly, but slowly, methodically, in full view of the besieging armies. The captives included women and children from their most recent raids, people they had kept alive as slaves and bargaining tools. Now, with death closing in, the Jomsvikings decided that if they could not win, they would at least ensure their enemies felt the full weight of their cruelty. They built pyres in the fortress courtyard and began burning their prisoners alive, one by one, while chanting ancient curses in the old tongue. The screams carried across the water to the besieging fleets, horrifying Christian warriors who thought they had seen the worst of pagan brutality. Even hardened veterans turned away as smoke rose from Jomsborg, carrying with it the smell of burning flesh and the sound of innocent suffering. The Jomsvikings were not just dying. They were choosing to become something even more monstrous in their final hours. King Sweyn ordered an immediate assault, hoping to end the horror quickly. But the fortress walls were thick, and the surviving Jomsvikings fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were already dead. They had nothing left to lose, no hope of survival, no reason to hold back any aspect of their trained cruelty. Every step the attackers took cost them dearly in blood. For 3 days and nights, the siege raged. The Vikings fought from room to room, corridor to corridor, making their enemies pay for every inch of stone. They booby-trapped their own fortress, filling it with hidden spears and burning pitch that claimed dozens of attackers. They poisoned their own wells rather than let their enemies drink from them. They destroyed everything they could not defend, ensuring that victory would taste like ashes in their enemies' mouths. But the end was inevitable. By the fourth morning, only a handful of Vikings remained alive, barricaded in their great hall with the last of their prisoners. The building was surrounded, the walls were breached, and Christian warriors pressed in from all sides. Palnatoke, bleeding from a dozen wounds, looked around at his surviving brothers and made one final, terrible decision. Rather than face capture, rather than give their enemies the satisfaction of public execution, the last Vikings would choose their own deaths. But they would not go quietly into the dark. They would ensure that their final act burned itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, a last gesture of defiance that would haunt their enemies' dreams for years to come. The Great Hall had been their home, their temple, their seat of power for nearly 30 years. Now it would become their tomb, and the manner of their dying would prove that even in defeat, even in death, the Vikings remained the most feared warriors in the Viking world. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations, too horrible for bards to sing, but too significant for history to forget. They chose to burn alive rather than surrender. But before the flames took them, the last Vikings performed one final act of evil that would haunt Europe's nightmares for centuries. This is how the most feared warriors in Viking history chose to meet their end. Inside the Great Hall of Jomsborg, surrounded by the sound of splintering wood and shouting enemies, Palnatoke gathered his last 20 warriors. The men who stood with him were not just brothers in arms. They were the final remnants of a brotherhood that had terrorized Europe for 3 decades. Each had survived countless battles. Each had committed acts of cruelty that would make normal men sick with horror. Now, with Christian warriors breaking down the doors, they faced their ultimate test. Palnatoke's plan was simple and horrible. They would set fire to their own hall, burning themselves alive rather than face capture. But they would not die alone. The last of their prisoners, 12 women and children from their final raids, would burn with them. Not as an accident of war, but as a deliberate final sacrifice to the gods who had abandoned them. It would be their last gift of terror to a world that had finally found the courage to destroy them. The decision was unanimous. These were men who had long ago abandoned any trace of mercy or human feeling. They had lived by violence, ruled through fear, and built their entire identity around the idea that they were superior to the weak and the innocent. If they must die, they would ensure that their death struck fear into the hearts of their enemies and sent a message that would echo through history. As the Christian warriors battered at the reinforced doors, the Vikings moved with grim efficiency. They soaked the wooden walls with oil and pitch, creating a furnace that would consume everything inside within minutes. They arranged their prisoners in a circle at the center of the hall, bound with iron chains that would prevent any escape once the flames began. The women wept, the children screamed, but the Vikings showed no more emotion than men arranging furniture. Palnatoke himself lit the first torch. As flames began to lick at the ancient timbers, he raised his sword and began the final chant. Not a prayer for mercy or forgiveness, but a curse upon everyone who had dared to challenge the brotherhood. His voice rose above the crackling fire and the terror of the innocent victims. By blood we were bound, by blood we lived, and by blood we die. Let those who destroyed us know that wolves never truly die. We are reborn in every act of cruelty, in every moment when strength crushes weakness. The other Vikings took up the chant, their voices creating a terrifying harmony as the fire spread around them. They had thrown off their armor, choosing to feel the flames fully as they consumed their flesh. This was not suicide. It was a ritual transformation, a final act of defiance that would ensure their names lived forever in infamy. Outside the burning hall, the Christian warriors had finally broken through the outer doors. but the smoke and heat drove them back, forcing them to watch helplessly as the structure became an inferno. They could hear the screams of the innocent prisoners mixing with the chanted curses of their captors, creating a sound that would haunt their dreams for years to come. King Sweyn Forkbeard arrived, just as the roof began to collapse. The man who had spent years planning the destruction of the Jomsvikings found himself staring at a sight that filled even his warrior's heart with horror. This was not the honorable death of defeated enemies. This was deliberate evil, chosen freely even in the face of death. The Jomsvikings had found a way to win even in losing, to strike terror even as they died. But the horror was not over. As the flames consumed the great hall, something unexpected began to happen. The fire spread to other buildings within the fortress, buildings that the besiegers had hoped to capture intact. The Jomsvikings had prepared for this moment, soaking every structure with oil and pitch. Their fortress would not survive them. It would become their funeral pyre and their final weapon against their enemies. The archaeological evidence tells us that the destruction was total. Every building burned, every wall was pulled down, every trace of Jomsviking power was systematically erased. But the psychological damage was harder to heal. The warriors who witnessed that final night spoke of it in whispers for the rest of their lives. They had come to destroy monsters and found that even in death, the monsters had found a way to wound them. The last confirmed Jomsviking leader, Sigvaldi the Treacherous, had not been present at the final siege. He had fled with a small group of survivors, hoping to rebuild the brotherhood elsewhere. But the network of enemies that had destroyed Jomsborg hunted them relentlessly. One by one, the surviving Jomsvikings were tracked down and killed, not in battle, but often murdered by their own men who sought pardons from Christian kings. Sigvaldi himself met his end in a Danish bog, stabbed 17 times by warriors who had once called him brother. His body, preserved by the bog's chemistry, was discovered in 1952 with clear evidence of the brutal assassination. Even among thieves and murderers, the Jomsviking name had become a curse that men wanted to escape. By 1000 CE, less than 15 years after their defeat at Hjörungavagr, the Jomsvikings had been completely erased from the world. Their fortress was demolished stone by stone. Their ships were burned, their weapons were melted down and blessed by Christian priests. The very island of Valin was renamed and resettled, its new inhabitants forbidden from even speaking the old names. But their legacy lived on in ways their enemies could not have imagined. The systematic cruelty they had perfected, the professional approach to warfare they had pioneered, the idea that brotherhood bonds could override all natural human feeling. These concepts spread through medieval Europe like poison. Later military orders would adopt their organizational structure. Future armies would copy their tactics of psychological warfare. The very word berserker gained new connotations of mindless savagery thanks to their ritualistic practices. The Jomsvikings had achieved a kind of immortality after all, but not the glorious eternal war they had dreamed of. Instead, they lived on as a warning, a reminder of what happens when warriors abandon honor for power, when brotherhood becomes conspiracy, and when the strong choose cruelty over courage. They had wanted to be remembered as the greatest Vikings who ever lived. Instead, they became the most hated, their names spoken only as curses and their story told as a lesson in how even the mightiest can fall when they lose their humanity. The wolves of Jomsborg were gone, but their howls still echoed across the centuries, reminding future generations that the capacity for organized evil dwells in every age, waiting for those willing to embrace the darkness within. The ghosts of Hjörungavagr Bay would not let them rest. Every night, Palnatok heard the screams of his warriors drowning in dark waters. Every morning, he woke to find his fortress walls closing in like a tomb. The Jomsvikings had ruled through fear for 30 years. Now fear was eating them alive from within. The defeat at Hjörungavagr had done more than kill 2,000 warriors. It had shattered the myth that made the Jomsvikings untouchable. Word spread across Europe like wildfire. The wolf pack could bleed. Kings who had paid tribute for decades stopped sending gold. Merchants who once fled at the sight of black sails now sailed past Jomsborg with armed escorts. Even the weather seemed to turn against them. Winter storms battered their fortress while their enemies grew stronger. Palnatoke tried to hold his brotherhood together through the old methods. Public executions of anyone who spoke of defeat. Ritual scarification to remind warriors of their oaths. Blood sacrifices to appease the gods who had abandoned them at Hjörungavágr. But doubt had taken root in hearts that once knew only certainty. For the first time in their history, Vikings began to question whether their path was truly blessed by the old gods. The questioning started in whispered conversations during night watches. Warriors spoke of dreams where they saw their own deaths, of omens that pointed toward doom. Some remembered families they had abandoned to join the Brotherhood. Others wondered if the Christians might be right, if their violent path was leading them not to Valhalla, but to some darker fate. These thoughts spread through the fortress like plague, weakening bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Young recruits stopped arriving from Denmark and Sweden. The stream of desperate warriors seeking glory and gold had dried up after news of the defeat reached every hall and tavern in Scandinavia. Without new blood, the Vikings faced a problem they had never considered. They were growing old. Warriors who had seemed invincible at 25 now struggled with battle wounds at 50. The brotherhood that had once seemed eternal was suddenly mortal. Palnatoke himself felt the weight of years pressing down like stones. His sword arm, once steady as an oak tree, now trembled after long battles. His mind, once sharp as a blade, wandered to memories of the early days when the future had seemed limitless. He had built something magnificent and terrible, but now he wondered if it would outlive him or die with him in the ruins of Jomsborg. The signs of decline were everywhere. Ships that once struck terror into merchant crews now leaked and groaned in rough weather. Weapons that had tasted victory in 100 battles now rusted in their racks. The great hall where warriors had once celebrated endless triumphs echoed with empty spaces where the dead had once sat. Even the wolf banners that had flown proudly above the fortress walls hung limp and faded. Then came news that chilled even hardened Viking hearts. King Canute of Denmark was gathering the largest army in Nordic history, not to conquer distant lands, but to sail to Valin Island and destroy the fortress that had once been Denmark's unofficial sword arm. The student was preparing to kill his teacher, and he was bringing 20,000 men to make sure the job was done right. Canute had learned from Haakon's victory at Hjörungavágr. He wouldn't meet the Vikings in open battle where their experience and desperation might give them an advantage. Instead, he would surround their island fortress and starve them out like wolves trapped in a cave. No honor, no glory, no warrior's death, just slow starvation and inevitable surrender. The irony cut deep into Viking pride. Canute himself was Palnatoke's nephew, raised on stories of his uncle's glory. As a boy, he had begged for tales of Viking raids and conquests. Now he wore a Christian cross and commanded armies that included warriors from the very nations the Vikings had terrorized. The old world was not just dying, it was being murdered by its own children. Messages arrived daily from across the Baltic. Every kingdom that had ever suffered under Viking terror was sending ships and men to join Canute's expedition. Norwegians who remembered Hjörungavágr, Swedes who had lost villages to wolf banner raids, Danes who wanted to prove their loyalty to their Christian king. Even Slavic tribes from the eastern shores were bringing warriors hungry for revenge. Inside Jomsborg, Palnatoke faced the hardest decision of his life. He could order his remaining warriors to fight to the death, ensuring that the Viking legend ended in blood and fire as it had been born. Or he could do something that went against everything the Brotherhood had ever stood for. He could surrender and hope for mercy from enemies who had learned cruelty from Viking teachers. The debates in the great hall grew heated as winter deepened. Older warriors demanded a final battle that would earn them places in Valhalla. Younger men spoke of escape, of scattering to distant lands where the Viking name might mean something again. A few even whispered of conversion, of abandoning the old gods for the Christian cross that seemed to bring victory to its followers. But Palnatoke knew there was no escape from what they had built. The Vikings had made too many enemies, caused too much pain, spilled too much innocent blood. They had chosen to become monsters, and monsters could not simply decide to become men again. The wolf pack that had terrorized Europe for 3 decades was finally cornered, and the end of their story was sailing toward them across dark winter seas. Spring brought death sailing under Danish banners. From the walls of Jomsborg, the surviving Vikings watched their doom approach. 200 ships carrying 20,000 warriors, all united by one purpose: to erase the wolf pack from history forever. King Canute's fleet stretched across the horizon like a floating city. Danish longships flew alongside Norwegian dragon boats, Swedish war galleys, and Slavic rivercraft. Warriors who had spent generations fighting each other now rode side by side, bound together by their shared hatred of the brotherhood that had terrorized their ancestors. The sight should have filled any defender with despair, but the Vikings had forgotten how to feel anything but rage. The siege began at dawn on a gray April morning. Canute's forces surrounded Volline Island completely, their ships forming an iron ring that nothing could cross. No food would reach the fortress. No messengers could escape. No help would come from allies who had already abandoned the brotherhood to its fate. The Vikings were trapped in their own stronghold, watching their supplies dwindle while their enemies grew stronger. For weeks, the two sides stared at each other across the water. Canute was in no hurry. Time was his ally now. Every day that passed made his enemies weaker while his own forces received fresh supplies from the mainland. He could afford to wait. The Vikings could not. Their children had always been war and conquest, but they had never learned to grow food or preserve peace. Jomsborg had been built for raiders, not for survivors. Palnatoke tried to maintain morale through the old rituals. Dawn sacrifices to ask the gods for victory. Evening ceremonies to honor fallen warriors. Midnight oaths sworn in blood and firelight. But hungry men make poor worshippers, and the gods seem to have stopped listening to prayers soaked in innocent blood. Even the most faithful warriors began to whisper that perhaps they had chosen the wrong path. The first surrender came in May. A young warrior named Eric, barely 20 years old, swam across the harbor under cover of darkness and begged for mercy from Canute's fleet. He brought news that struck fear into Viking hearts. Nearly a third of the fortress guards were talking about following his example. The brotherhood that had once seemed united by unbreakable bonds was cracking under pressure like ice in spring. More defections followed. Warriors who had sworn to die for the brotherhood instead chose to live for themselves. Some escaped by boat under cover of storms. Others simply walked into the sea and drowned rather than face starvation or surrender. The great hall that had once echoed with victory songs now rang with arguments and accusations as remaining warriors turned on each other. Palnatoke felt his life's work crumbling around him like sand castles before the tide. Everything he had built, the fortress, the brotherhood, the legend, was dissolving under the patient pressure of his nephew's siege. He had created something that could conquer armies but could not feed itself. The Vikings had perfected the art of taking life, but never learned the skill of preserving it. By midsummer, only 300 warriors remained in Jomsborg. They were gaunt shadows of their former selves, surviving on seaweed and fish scraps, drinking rainwater collected in rusted helmets. Their weapons still gleamed with deadly purpose, but their bodies lacked the strength to wield them effectively. The wolf pack had become a gathering of starving dogs. The end came not with a great battle, but with a whimper of defeat. On a hot July morning, Palnatoke walked alone to the fortress gates and threw his sword into the harbor. The sound of the blade hitting water seemed to echo across the entire Baltic Sea, the death knell of the most feared military force in medieval Europe. The last Viking war chief was surrendering to the nephew he had once carried on his shoulders as a boy. What followed was swift and final. Canute's forces stormed the fortress without resistance, finding hundreds of weapons, but only a handful of warriors still capable of fighting. They burned the great hall where 1,000 victory feasts had been held. They tore down the wooden walls that had protected the brotherhood for half a century. They shattered the bone-carved pillars and melted the golden arm rings taken from defeated enemies. The surviving Vikings faced different fates based on their crimes and their willingness to convert. Some became thralls, condemned to lives of slavery, serving the families they had once terrorized. Others accepted baptism and joined monastery communities, spending their remaining years in prayer and penance. A few were executed as examples, their heads displayed on spikes to show that the age of warrior brotherhoods was truly over. Palnatoke himself knelt before his nephew in the ruins of his own throne room. The old warrior who had defied kings and gods now begged for a merciful death from a young man wearing a Christian cross. Canute granted his request, not out of family love, but as a final insult. Palnatoke would die not as a warrior in battle, but as a criminal under an executioner's axe. The destruction was total and deliberate. Canute ordered every trace of Jomsborg erased from the earth. The fortress walls were torn down stone by stone. The harbor was filled with rocks to prevent ships from landing. Even the island's name was changed, as if the very memory of the place needed to be scrubbed from history. Within a generation, grass grew where the great hall had stood. Within a century, fishermen cast nets in waters where wolf-banner ships had once terrorized merchant vessels. The Vikings became a cautionary tale told by Christian monks, a reminder of what happened to those who rejected God's mercy for the false promises of pagan violence. But their legacy lived on in darker ways. Military historians would study their organization and tactics for centuries. Modern armies would borrow their ideas about professional soldiers and military discipline. The concept of warrior brotherhoods that valued loyalty above family, duty above conscience, and victory above honor would echo through history in forms both subtle and terrifying. The Vikings had set out to preserve the Viking way of life against Christian conversion and royal authority. Instead, they had created something that was neither Viking nor Christian, neither honorable nor merciful. They had become the monsters they claimed to fight against. And in the end, the world had destroyed them as monsters deserve to be destroyed. Their fortress was gone. Their warriors were dead or scattered. Their legend had become a warning rather than an inspiration. But the darkness they had unleashed, the idea that some causes justified any cruelty, that some battles were worth abandoning all humanity, would survive long after their bones had turned to dust in unmarked graves.